This book tells the story about an orphan girl, Eyre, who lives with her own family, who has one son and two daughters, and the maid, Bessie. The relationship between Jane and her own family is really bad, and she decides to leave that house.
She goes to Lowood Institution, where most of the children who are there have lost their parents. The food is horrible there, and she only has one friend, Helen Barnes.
And unfortunately, typhus fever arrives at Lowood. Helen gets ill and dies. Jane gets support from Mrs. Temple, one of the kindest teachers in Lowood. Due to the typhus fever, there is an inspection of Lowood Institution, and they see that there are awful conditions there, and decide to take the children to another better place.
She spends 8 years in this place, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher. But when Miss Temple leaves the school, she decides to go too. She becomes governess from Adele, a girl who lives in Thornfield. When she arrives at Thornfield, the master of the house isn't there.
A few days later, Jane meets Mr. Rochester, the master of Thornfield. They both spend the day together, and Mr. Rochester talks to her about his life.
One night, Jane wakes up because she hears a voice. Suddenly, she sees fire on Mr. Rochester's bed. She extinguishes the fire with a pitcher of water. Some days later, Mr. Rochester invites some friends at home. One of them is a beautiful woman called Miss Blanche. She and Mr. Rochester sing some songs together. Jane is jealous of her.
Some days later, Mr. Mason arrives at Thornfield from Jamaica and asks Mr. Rochester to stay at Thornfield that night. Mr. Rochester accepts but is so nervous because of that. At night, someone beats Mr. Mason and hurts him. Next day, Robert, Bessie's husband, comes to talk with Jane. He gives bad news to Jane. Her cousin has killed himself and her aunt is really ill. He asks Jane to come home.
Jane arrives to Gateshead. She has a conversation with her aunt. They both are still angry with each other, but the aunt has to give Jane a letter from her uncle John. In the letter, John tells to Jane that he wants to make Jane heiress because he hasn't got sons. The next day morning, her aunt dies. Her relationship with her cousins is better now. 1 month later, she returns to Thornfield. Mr. Rochester wants to marry with Jane, and he asks her to marry him. Jane is incredibly happy and says yes.
The night before the wedding, Jane dreams that someone puts on her wedding dress and tears her veil. But when she gets up, she sees that everything has happened. That's strange. Next morning, they are at the ceremony. Everything is perfect, but suddenly Mr. Bridge arrives and tells to everyone that Mr. Rochester is already married with Bertha Mason since 15 years ago. Mr. Rochester has his wife closed in a room. She's crazy and has a monster face.
When she notices this, she leaves Mr. Rochester and Thornfield. She walks around the near villages since he meets St. John, a clergy, who gives her a job. Some months later, St. John gives a letter from Mr. Bridge, a lawyer, to Jane. He says that Jane is rich because she has received the heritage from his uncle, John Eyre, £20,000.
Then she wants to know about Mr. Rochester. She decides to go to Thornfield. When she arrives, she sees Thornfield destroyed and she asks someone what has happened. Mr. Rochester's wife burned Thornfield and killed himself. Then she looks for Mr. Rochester. He is receiving treatment in a house because in the accident he has gone blind. Jane asks him for marriage. The wedding is humble. Some years later, she regains sight and he can see her. son with his own eyes.